For this week's guest, we are joined by Tim Weiner. He is a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist. His previous book, Legacy of Ashes, won the National Book Award. It's an account of the first 60 years of the CIA. This new book, The Mission, which is a New York Times bestseller, picks up the story in the 21st century. Now, Tim and I spoke before this interview because him and I don't agree on a very fundamental issue when it comes to the CIA, and that is the CIA's role in Russiagate and also the Ukraine proxy war, which Tim and I see quite differently. And we agreed beforehand not to get into a debate because that would entail getting into a whole bunch of arcane details, which you need to get into if you want to litigate Russiagate properly. So we put aside our differences, although we do discuss the issue a little bit in this interview, to focus on other aspects of his work, which covers many, many decades of the CIA in action. So here is our interview with Tim Weiner. Tim Weiner, thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Your first book on the CIA, Legacy of Ashes, takes us through the CIA's first 50 years. Your new book, The Mission, which has just come out, picks up the story where you left off. So let's start there. In what position does the CIA find itself in the late 1990s, and where does it go?
The CIA was in bad shape in the late 1990s. The collapse of the Soviet Union had left it bereft of an enemy. Its mission, for the first 45 years was to oppose Soviet imperialism through methods fair and foul. You take away the great enemy, how are you going to be a great intelligence service? And people were literally asking themselves and their superiors, what is the mission now? Well, it began to come into focus in 1998 when Al-Qaeda blew up two American embassies at once, one in Dar es Salaam and one in Nairobi. Two at once was 100 times harder than one. And the CIA had to confront a terrorist organization that was capable of hitting two targets simultaneously 3,000 miles from its base in Afghanistan. And although bin Laden had been on the CIA's radar very much for more than 2 years, the CIA didn't have any intelligence about Al-Qaeda, next to zero. And this was still the case on the 12th of September, 2001. And in The Mission, I quote Bob Gates, who was then the former CIA director and the future Secretary of Defense under Bush and Obama, as saying, on the 12th of September, we didn't know jack shit about Al-Qaeda. And if, the CIA had a great dossier on who's who in the Al-Qaeda zoo and how they move money around, how they move people around, their intentions and capabilities, then what came later, the secret prisons, the torture, never would have been necessary. But the fact is, the United States had just been attacked by an enemy it knew nothing about. So the first response of Bush was, see if Saddam Hussein had something to do with this. He didn't, but the decision was taken on September 17, 2001, that the United States was going to attack Iraq. That's where we were in September 2001, 24 years ago.
Okay, I have two follow-ups for you. When you say that the CIA's mission in its first 50 years was to fight Soviet imperialism, someone might say, well, what does overthrowing a socialist government in Guatemala have to do with fighting Soviet imperialism? So was this always about the Soviets, or was the Soviets used as an excuse just to target global South movements that didn't accept being, pawns of Western hegemony? That's my first question. My second question is, when the CIA didn't know anything about Al-Qaeda, didn't the CIA support what became Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan? And weren't there warnings before 9/11 about bin Laden being poised to attack the U.S.? So how was it that the CIA claims to be so uninformed about a group that it used to support?
First, the coups in Guatemala and in Iran and in so much else that presidents ordered the CIA to do was American imperialism.
Yeah.
Let's make no bones about that. Okay.
That's our lane.
Secondly, so I reported from Afghanistan starting in 1987 during the Soviet occupation and returned half a dozen times. The last was the American invasion and occupation of Afghanistan. So 6 trips over the course of 15 years. And I made a very close study of CIA support for the Afghan guerrillas during and after the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. Bin Laden also supported the Afghan guerrillas in their fight against the Soviets, but the United States didn't support Bin Laden or Al-Qaeda. That's an important distinction that sometimes gets blurred. Bin Laden wasn't that big a presence during the Soviet jihad. He was just another rich Saudi who was buying weapons and equipment for the Mujahideen. There were more than a few of them floating around, I can guarantee you, because I saw them with my eyes, in Afghanistan and Pakistan in the late 80s and early 90s. These pious Wahhabi Saudis with long white robes, just rich assholes, showing up in poor villages in Afghanistan and saying, I am the emir of this valley now. Here's a bunch of money. So when you say the CIA supported Al-Qaeda, that's not the case. They both supported the Afghan guerrillas against the Soviets. And then the US walked away from Afghanistan and provided no material support except for USAID supplying wheat until after 9/11. And then they went in with all 4 hooves and a snout, all in.
You spoke to former CIA Director Richard Helms, and this is what you said about your exchange. You say, he wanted me to understand that the agency hadn't dreamed up the idea of overthrowing Iran or killing Fidel Castro. Every president since Truman had commanded the CIA to intervene with guns and money to control the fate of nations when sending in the Marines was not an option. So did you get the sense, and this is related to Aaron's question, but did you get the sense that the CIA felt guilt for what it had done? Was this something that they tried to ever oppose? Were they always unquestioningly following orders?
You mean support for the Afghan fighters during the Soviet occupation? Or are you talking about the whole Cold War history?
The whole Cold War history, and how much does that apply to the new CIA or the 21st century CIA?
Right. Good question. So it took me a while to understand this simple but important point. The CIA is an executor of American foreign policy. It doesn't dream up coups and plots and other nefarious covert activities. With rare exceptions, it does what the president tells it to do. It's not like a couple of CIA officers were sitting around drinking martinis in some sort of, Mad Men setting. And one of them says in 1960, hey, I got a good idea. Let's go kill Fidel Castro. They didn't dream up that mission. Presidents Eisenhower and Kennedy, and President Kennedy's brother Bobby, wanted Castro gone. And when it came time to investigate the first 25 years of the CIA and its Cold War history, the Church Committee in the 1970s dove deep into this, about as deep as you can get. And in the beginning of the Church Committee hearings, Frank Church, the senator who ran them, wondered aloud if, I'm quoting him, if the CIA has become a rogue elephant trampling people and nations. Well, come to find out, and he himself said so in so many words after the Church Committee hearings. When the elephant tramples people and nations, it's not the elephant's fault. It is the fault of the mahout, the elephant driver. And that was the president of the United States. And, the Church Committee and even the torture report about what went on in the CIA's secret prisons that the Senate finally released in part 10 years ago, really tiptoes around this question of presidential authority for violations of the laws of God and man and the Geneva Convention by the CIA. It's the president's outfit. It is a unique expression of presidential power to order the CIA to go and kill people or torture them.
Even before I came into office, I was very clear that in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, we did some things that were wrong. We did a whole lot of things that were right, but we tortured some folks.
Or throw them in secret prisons for the rest of their lives, never to see the light of day. You know, the CIA was not created to run secret prisons or to torture people or to kill people. It was created to gather intelligence. And when, after 9/11, in the spirit of fear and panic and, a lack of intelligence, the idea was broached, well, what are we going to do with all these prisoners we're taking? There was nobody who knew how to run a prison. There weren't enough people who spoke Arabic, or Pushtu, the language of Eastern Afghanistan, or Dari, the language of Western Afghanistan. And there was only one guy who knew how to torture people, and that was a guy named Charlie Wise, who's profiled in the mission, who had been busted for teaching torture to the Contras in the 1980s. They drug up Charlie Wise.
And the Contras, just to explain for people, that's the guerrilla force armed by the U.S. in Nicaragua fighting to overthrow the Sandinista government.
Not by Nicaragua. They were fighting to overthrow the government of Nicaragua.
Yeah.
They were armed and backed by America's right-wing allies in Central America.
Yeah.
And my point is that the men and the women who were ordered to do this and did this, they knew they were going to get caught. They knew there would be hell to pay. It is very hard to keep a secret in America. Thank God. They knew that the fact that the president had authorized them to do that did not prevent them from getting it in the neck. Because the president wouldn't take that spear. He said, oh, we don't torture. This is after the story had come out, thanks to courageous and brilliant journalists at the Washington Post and the New York Times. He was like, we don't torture. One of the more Orwellian statements Bush made.
I want to be absolutely clear with our people and the world. The United States does not torture. It's against our laws and it's against our values. I have not authorized it and I will not authorize it. That questioning the detainees in this program has given us information that has saved innocent lives by helping us stop new attacks.
And if he said it wasn't torture, then it wasn't torture. The upshot of this is, of course, Obama closed the secret prisons, in his first days in office, and he made the decision that it would be better to kill these people than imprison them. And the second is that Mike Hayden, the CIA director for the last 3 years of Bush, said the next president that wants to waterboard people better bring his own bucket because we're out of the business. And you could argue that they never wanted to be in the business, but the president told them to do it. They thought that torture would get them great intelligence. This is a lie they told themselves. Okay. The techniques of torture that the U.S. was practicing had been, learned and then adapted over the years from what the North Vietnamese did to American prisoners of war, almost all of them downed pilots during the war in Vietnam. They didn't torture people for intelligence. The downed pilots didn't know what the next bombing raid was going to be. They tortured them to elicit false confessions of war crimes, not to gather intelligence, but to gather lies. And just to finish this thought, when the torture report came out, again, it tiptoed around the question of presidential authority. This is not to, issue like my own blanket pardon to the CIA, but
they work for the president, not the other way around.
Precept. No, this all followed the precept of the great Richard Milhous Nixon, who once said, if the president does it, that means it is not illegal.
Well, when the president does it, that means that it is not illegal. By definition. Exactly.
And your book, tells a story of the great lengths to which the CIA went to cover up for torture. Talk to us about, 2 episodes. There, you have this controversy over an attempt to destroy videotapes of torture at a CIA secret prison in Thailand. And then you also have the CIA spying on the Senate as the Senate is investigating the CIA's torture program.
Yes. Two unhappy stories. The first is rather more dramatic. So, by a series of unfortunate accidents, a man named Jose Rodriguez became the chief of counterterrorism about a year or so after 9/11. And Jose, by his own admission, he had been chief of the Latin American division, and he had been removed for what the inspector general at the CIA called a serious lack of judgment. Jose, by his own admission, didn't know jack shit about terrorism, but now he's the chief of counterterrorism. And he has basically on his own dime given, a verbal order. This wasn't yet a written order, verbal order from the president of the United States. He set up this base in Thailand where 2 of the CIA's first so-called high-value prisoners were taken and inflicted torture upon them. And present at the base for one of those prisoners' torture was Gina Haspel, who later became his chief of staff when he became the chief of the clandestine service, the top spy. And she later became the CIA director in the first Trump administration. So Jose has this philosophy that it's better to ask for forgiveness than ask for permission. And he asked for permission to destroy the tapes from everybody who would be in a position of authority to grant it, and they all tell him no. The CIA director tells him no, the White House counsel tells him no, and the in-house lawyer, the chief lawyer at the CIA, tells him, absolutely not, Jose. He writes an order, he gives it to Haspel to transmit. Haspel transmits the orders, the videotapes are destroyed, and they are actually under a judge's subpoena to preserve all evidence concerning these matters. Well, the CIA's top lawyer, John Rizzo, he is a veteran of Iran-Contra and those scandals from the 80s, and he knows a scandal when he sees one, and he goes rip shit. Jose is the chief of the clandestine service of the CIA, and he has arguably just committed a felony and disregarded orders from on high. There was a criminal investigation of this, and Jose wound up, after his retirement, with a letter of reprimand from the CIA, which he promised he would frame upon receipt. When Gina Haspel becomes the CIA director, 10 years later under Trump in 2018, anything anybody knows about Gina Haspel is that she was at the CIA base when the torture was conducted, and she transmitted an order from her boss to destroy the tapes. Well, it turns out Gina Haspel, when she became the CIA director for the last 3 years of Trump 1.0, was pretty effective at defending the CIA from Trump. Trump hates and fears the CIA. He sees it as the capital of the deep state. And parenthetically, I'm here to tell your listeners that there is no deep state. The secret, cryptocracy of soldiers and spies that secretly pulls the strings on everything. It doesn't exist. Your second question about the torture report. It is a fact that the CIA launched a counterintelligence investigation into the Senate staff during the final year of the publication, before the publication of the torture report.
Is that legal for the CIA to launch an investigation of Americans, especially American politicians?
It was American Senate staffers, technically.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, the CIA has no police powers in this country.
Yeah.
Counterintelligence is an intelligence activity that you undertake when you're looking for spies and for leakers from within the intelligence community.
Okay.
So if you're a CIA lawyer, you can tailor a suit of armor to protect your people. But there was, in fact, a criminal referral to the Justice Department, which never acted on it.
Of course.
Yeah, when John Brennan, who was then the CIA director, found out about this, and there's some dispute as to who actually authorized this. Memories sometimes get a little foggy when you're in this terrain.
Yeah.
It happens.
When the CIA director Brennan found out about it, he was shocked, and he called off the dogs.
That's what he says, but didn't Dianne Feinstein basically accuse Brennan of misleading her?
Oh, yeah.
I have grave concerns that the CIA's search may well have violated the separation of powers principles embodied in the United States Constitution.
The director of the CIA, John Brennan, denied that the agency did anything wrong.
As far as the allegations of, CIA hacking into, Senate computers, nothing could be further from the truth. I mean, we wouldn't do that.
Feinstein accused not Brennan personally, but the CIA of, spying on them, and accused Brennan of basically throwing sand in her eyes.
Right.
Brennan put out a public statement when this, spying was disclosed, and he said, "What?" He didn't know about it. It was an ill-advised public statement. So finally, Vice President Biden had to call him in for a come to Jesus meeting, and said, "Let us beat our swords into plowshares, and shake hands, and so forth and so on." And Brennan apologized to Senator Feinstein. Yeah.
So it's a nice, it's kind of a convenient feedback loop of blame, right? Because one gets to blame the other. Like the CIA can say the president made me do it, and then the president can say the CIA did it without my knowing.
Well, there used to be a way of preventing this kind of tragic comedy. Okay. In 1981, a few years after the Church Committee revealed some of the darker moments of CIA history, there was a law duly enacted, took effect in the first year of the Reagan administration, was that the president had to sign a finding. And that's a term that means he signs a document saying, "I find that this covert operation is essential to the national security of the United States." Okay. So no more who me and no more plausible deniability. That was the intent of the law. Well, come to find 5 years later, Reagan and CIA Director Casey are shipping arms to the Iranian Revolutionary Guard as hostage ransom, marking up the price 600%, skimming the proceeds, and backhanding it to the Contras in Central America in violation of a law passed by Congress cutting off support for the Contras.
The Iran-Contra scandal.
When the president follows Nixon precept that the president does, if the president does it, that means it is not illegal. You are approaching a state of failing democracy. Last year, the Supreme Court, by a 6-3 decision, ruled that a president is immune from prosecution for crimes committed in office. And under this ruling, according to Justice Sotomayor and other legal scholars, if Donald Trump tomorrow calls up the CIA and says, I want you to assassinate this political enemy of mine. No fingerprints. His fingerprints are, of course, on it. He could do that. The dangers that the CIA presents to the United States are by and large dangers of unchecked presidential power. And we are entering a new and extremely dangerous era in this country under Trump. Look at the collection of crackpots and fools that Trump has put atop the national security establishment of the United States. Over at the Pentagon, you've got the white Christian nationalist Pete Hegseth. Whiskey Pete, his friends used to call him. He doesn't know any more about how to run the Pentagon than I could build a rocket ship to the moon. Over at the Directorate of National Intelligence, you have Tulsi Gabbard, a conspiracy theorist who is now plumping to have Barack Obama indicted for treason for overseeing the CIA when it was investigating ties between Team Trump and Team Putin. At the FBI, you've got the right-wing podcaster and MAGA acolyte, Kash Patel, who is running or ruining the FBI, dismantling its national security and intelligence divisions. And at the CIA, you have John Ratcliffe, another MAGA soldier, who is doing incredible damage by conducting an ideological purge of senior people who won't toe Trump's line. Same thing is happening at the FBI. People are getting fired right and left because they're not MAGA. The upshot of all this is that the dangers of a catastrophic intelligence failure are as great, maybe greater, than they were in the months before 9/11. And to top it all off, you've got a president who puts intelligence in scare quotes, doesn't believe a word of it. He is an ideologue. And if you are an ideologue, you don't need intelligence. Your mind's already made up. Can you imagine, and I ask this of both of you rhetorically, can you imagine what Trump would do if the United States were attacked again at home or abroad? Your thoughts?
Is Trump more of an ideologue and less intelligence-based than, say, than W. Bush was? Because I don't disagree with what you're saying about Trump. I just wonder how exceptional he is. And I do think he is exceptional in some ways, but I often think that people will either over-exceptionalize him or they will, in almost a reactive way, downplay how exceptional he is. I feel like he's not a total departure, and he's not a total continuation either.
Presidents before Trump have abused the powers of the CIA by ordering it to try and kill foreign leaders, by ordering it to spy on Americans in violation of its charter. The CIA has no police powers in this country. Those are two examples, and Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon did all that in spades. I think that if the United States were hit again, at home or abroad, Trump, and he's already part of the way down this road, would send out the military to control cities across the country, declare martial law, and probably cancel the next elections. And then we are all the way down the road to a failed democracy and a dawning autocracy. And this is why I think the attacks on the very idea of intelligence in this country are a really dangerous thing. And I think in that regard, Trump is exceptional, although he hasn't yet abused the CIA in the ways that some of his predecessors did. Not yet.
Well, I mean, my response, we'd have to litigate our respective views on the issue of Trump and Russia, where, Tim, as we discussed before this broadcast personally, you and I disagree on that one, and we're not going to get into all the details. But I will say, look, if you're calling Tulsi Gabbard a conspiracy theorist, personally, I think the Trump-Russia thing was a conspiracy theory that was used by the intelligence agencies. And even if you disagree with me on that, the conspiracy theory that Saddam was in cahoots with Al-Qaeda was a very dangerous conspiracy theory, and that was pushed by the CIA as well. So even if Tulsi Gabbard is a conspiracy theorist, that wouldn't be new. And let me make one more point. Regardless, where I'll agree with you is that I see in this administration some dangerous trends. The crackdown on free speech, especially for people who criticize Israel, that's, the rounding up of undocumented immigrants. That to me is a new level of cruelty that we haven't seen in this country. And especially when it comes to cracking on civil liberties, the attack on students who simply criticize Israel, that to me is something that I haven't seen before, that I find very concerning, that is unique to Trump. And certainly, is Tulsi Gabbard guilty of weaponizing intelligence in the same way others have? Yeah. I mean, for example, on Venezuela, which the Trump administration is trying to have regime change, Tulsi Gabbard basically overruled her own intelligence analysts and went along with the Trump administration's line that the Venezuelan government is controlling some gang that's a threat to the U.S., even though I'm not even sure if that gang even exists anymore. So, and then Tulsi Gabbard also, after she said that Iran does not have a nuclear weapons program, Trump insulted her by saying that I don't care what she says.
Tulsi Gabbard testified in March that the intelligence community said Iran wasn't building a nuclear weapon.
I don't care what she said. I think they were very close to having.
And Tulsi Gabbard kind of backed down and put out a sort of weaselly statement that catered to Trump. So I certainly see in the current administration weaponizing intelligence in a dangerous way. I guess where I disagree is, while there are some aspects I think are unique, I also think, as you seem to think too, there are previous cases that have so far at least been more dangerous, like namely the Iraq War.
Yeah. I mean, just one point. The CIA did its damnedest to debunk the notion that was coming from Cheney and his camp that there was a Saddam al-Qaeda connection. There was none. And the CIA knew that and tried to convince the president of it. And going back to the Iraq War, one of the CIA officers I quote in this book said, these guys, meaning the Bushies, would have gone to war if Saddam had a rubber band and a paper clip to put your eye out.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes. They were hell bent on it. And it didn't matter what the intelligence said. And with Trump, as you correctly point out, it doesn't matter what the intelligence says. This is true of Marco Rubio, who said vis-a-vis Iran, forget about the intelligence. Well, he knows better.
Yeah.
But as the late great governor of Texas, Ann Richards, once said of George H.W. Bush, he's put his manhood in a blind trust, our Secretary of State. And you look at him, and he seems to be, his soul seems to be shriveling up inside his body. His eyes are deadening. It's like he's dying inside every day. Or that's my sympathetic read of Secretary of State Rubio.
Let me ask you about Syria, because we're talking about the CIA in this century. And the Syria proxy war, regime change war, was a major CIA operation. According to the New York Times, the budget was around $1 billion a year, possibly more, according to documents from Edward Snowden. But there's still a lot of secrecy around it, including precisely when it even began. I know that Obama signed a presidential finding in 2013, but I suspect that the operation began earlier because there were weapons going from Benghazi, Libya, to the rebels in Syria way before 2013. What's your sense of how big the CIA operation in Syria was? And based on the research you've done, what's your sense of what the CIA was involved in?
Yeah, I never got to the bottom of the CIA in Syria, frankly. That is a story that's going to take years to report, and a book needs a back cover. And I was bound and determined to meet my deadline and get this book out this summer. The book, by the way, is number 3 on the New York Times bestseller list right now, so I'm pretty happy about that.
Congratulations.
On Syria, Syria served and had served since 2006 as the way station for fighters and weapons who were opposing the U.S. occupation of Iraq and for the forces that morphed into ISIS. When Gaddafi was overthrown in Libya, the nation's arsenals of weapons were thrown open, and the arsenals flooded the Middle East with weapons, and some of those obviously got to the Syrian groups that were backed by the United States. What I know of the CIA in Syria is that it was a big operation. It was definitely backing a specific group that wasn't terribly effective at actually fighting. They were effective in gathering money, weapons, and support. How can I put this politely? The moral ambiguity of the CIA's role in Syria is a story that remains to be told, as are many of the operational details, maybe for the paperback, if I get lucky.
Are you going to do the Audible, by the way? Because I know someone else did it. I was listening to it on Audible, and it's very funny to me because that's the guy who does it is someone who's done a lot of like Bosch mysteries.
Oh, Stefan Rudnicki, the reader of the book?
Yeah.
He's a genius.
Yeah.
He's a genius. He has a beautiful voice.
Yeah, he does. But it's good actually because I've listened to so many mysteries that he's narrated, so it gives it like an extra suspenseful, thrillerish.
Stefan Rudnicki is the best in the business.
In the time we have left, I know that this isn't the CIA's beat, but I'm curious, given the scale of this crisis in Gaza right now and the deep U.S. involvement, what do you think of it? What do you think of what Trump is doing with his unfettered support for Israel as it carries out what, I consider and many people consider to be a genocide?
Every president since Truman, since Israel's creation in 1948, has given Israel unquestioned military support and diplomatic support. Violence and corruption of the Netanyahu government has drawn worldwide condemnation. The slaughter of civilians in Gaza has drawn worldwide condemnation. But not only is the United States still unwavering in its support for Israel, it has become a crime, it appears, in the United States to speak out in defense of the people of Gaza and against the war. Now, you guys, I am so old that when I was 13, I convinced my father to take me to the big Mobilization Day rally in Washington, November 15th, 1969. 300,000 people or more showed up. It was the first massive demonstration against the war and against Richard Nixon, and it was not the last. When it becomes a thought crime in the United States to speak out against war, we are in a very bad place. And the attack on free speech, the attack on the free press, and the attack on people voicing their thoughts and opinions in public is not something that a democracy can sustain. I sometimes teach classes, and I never fail to point out that no free republic in the history of civilization has lasted longer than 300 years, and that was the Roman Empire. We're coming up on 250. I don't need to point that out. My mother escaped Hitler's Germany by the skin of her teeth, and I don't aim to see my daughters grow up in a failing democracy or a rising autocracy.
Going back to this idea of ideology and intelligence, can you just speak a little bit to how the intelligence failure around Iraq happened? How much was it a mistake, which some people argue, versus an intentional dishonesty? That's one question. And then how do you go about writing a book like this where you are getting people to give you quotes on the record while at the same time being critical? Because if you're critical, is the fear that they will not talk to you again?
I go pretty deep in the mission into the question of how could the CIA's analysts have reported that Saddam Hussein had an arsenal bristling with weapons of mass destruction? And the answer to that is they didn't have any intelligence on Iraq. The latest intelligence, the most recent intelligence they had was 5 years old, dating from 1998, when Saddam kicked out the UN weapons inspectors who were looking for these programs, and with them the CIA officers who were working under the UN's cover. Saddam wanted the world, and in particular his mortal enemies, the Iranians, to think that he had weapons of mass destruction. Because if they thought he had them, that would be a deterrent against an attack. Nobody at the CIA figured this out until it was too late. So in the fall of 2002, the Senate Intelligence Committee requested a formal, it's called a National Intelligence Estimate, a formal report on the state of Iraq's WMD, and they wanted it in a couple of weeks. And normally these things take like 6 months minimum to gin up. And the CIA's analysts took little shards and fragments of intelligence, almost all of it outdated, and they cobbled together this report, which was false. Did the White House skew the CIA's reporting? The CIA skewed itself. Okay. God knows there was pressure from Cheney and his crew to reach that conclusion. But that wasn't the decisive element. The decisive element was that they didn't have any intelligence, and the intelligence they did believe was false. And they didn't know the difference. Why do people at the CIA talk to me on the record? I have theories, although no definitive answer. I've been at this since 1987. And if you hang around long enough, people begin to trust you. Second, Legacy of Ashes, the history of the CIA that I published 18 years ago, was generally regarded by intelligence professionals as a pretty good book. People had, quibbles about the interpretation of documents and so forth. But it was the first history of the CIA written entirely from declassified documents and on-the-record interviews. So that gave a certain weight. The other is that it is amazing what happens if you ask politely.
Right.
A fourth factor is that I think when people reach a certain age, something inside them wants their stories to be told so that it doesn't wind up, in a top secret file cabinet locked in a, triple cipher coded safe. It's human nature. I mean, when I was a teenager, way back in the 20th century, I used to hitchhike. You could do it back then, coast to coast. And people always pick me up. And people pick me up, not so much out of the milk of human kindness, but because they were bored. It's a big country. And they wanted somebody to talk to. And they wanted to talk about the most fascinating thing in the world, which was, of course, themselves. But you had to ask questions. You had to ask about them. You had to hear them out. And of course, I didn't know what I was doing. I was 15, 16, or 17, but what I was doing is learning how to do an interview and how to listen. And maybe at the end of the day, everybody wants to talk about themselves.
I haven't finished it. I am reading it. I'm going back and forth reading and listening to it. But what would you do if someone misrepresented something? Like, do you then out them? Do you just not include it in the book?
I am so old that I grew up typing my first stories on high-backed Underwood typewriters on triplicate carbons, where they would be set in hot ink. This was before laptops, people. This was before fax machines. This is 1979. And we had a lot of crusty old editors, who had been at this since, black and white movies. And one hard and fast rule that your old and crusty editors told you was, if your mother says she loves you, check it out. And I do my absolute damnedest to never, ever go with a single source on a factual question. I ask, who do you know who can confirm this? Who else should I talk to about this? Will you vouch for me with that person, since I don't know them? And so on and so on. Going with a single source story is not a good idea in journalism or in any form of intelligence. Reporters are only as good as their sources. That's
and
true.
What stands out about your book, if I can just say, what stands out about your book is I think it's the first time I've ever read about the CIA where no source is anonymous. Everybody's on the record.
And did anyone, I don't know if you can answer this, but did anyone you talked to say something that you tried to verify, discovered it wasn't true? And then if they did you just cut them out?
When people go on the record, they're less likely to lie to you. Way less likely. Because they're on the record, their names are attached to what they say. This is a form of accountability. There are always going to be differences of opinion and nuances of interpretation as to how something happened, particularly when you're dealing, with world historical events. But, when I'm writing about Afghanistan, I was on the ground, for months on end over the course of 15 years in Afghanistan. When I'm writing about, the internal makeup of the CIA and how the different parts of it interact, I've been studying this since the Reagan administration. But the hardest thing to do is not the reporting. It's writing a simple declarative sentence, like a subject, verb, object, period. You know how hard that is? It's really hard. It's taken me like 40 years to learn how to begin to do it. And what I want to do is write here a story, a history that explains how secret power works in America. I've never covered politics. I haven't been a Washington journalist since 1999. Maybe this gives me a different set of eyes.
The book is called The Mission, the CIA in the 21st Century. It's the follow-up to the National Book Award-winning classic Legacy of Ashes. Tim Weiner, thank you so much for joining us.
And it's great. Listen or read it. It's great both ways.
Appreciate you guys.
Thanks.
You.
And thanks again to Tim Weiner for joining us again. The book is called The Mission, the CIA in the 21st Century. That's our show. Thank you so much for tuning in to Useful Idiots. We'll see you next time. Thanks so much for listening to and watching Useful Idiots. For extended episodes, bonus content, and our weekly Thursday Throwdown episode, please subscribe at usefulidiotspodcast.com. Support the show for free by subscribing on YouTube, Rumble, and wherever you get your podcasts. And if you like the podcast, don't forget to rate and review. You can also follow us on Twitter at UsefulIdiotPod. Thanks for supporting independent media. We'll see you next time.